What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy sits down for what should be a routine morning interview, only to discover the host has a completely different agenda? Well, you're about to find out. And trust me, this is one morning television moment that nobody saw coming. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story is absolutely wild from start to finish. It was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. Clint Eastwood, the man who defined cool in Hollywood for over 6 decades, had agreed to appear on Good Morning America to discuss his latest film project. At 94, Eastwood still commanded immense respect in the industry, and his presence on any talk show was considered a major booking. Network executives were thrilled to have secured the interview, knowing that Eastwood rarely did television appearances anymore. George Stephanopoulos had been briefed on the talking points. The conversation was meant to focus on Eastwood's new movie, his reflections on his storied career, and perhaps a light discussion about his directing process. Standard fare for a morning show. Producers had even prepared a montage of clips from Eastwood's most iconic films to play during the segment. But from the moment Eastwood walked onto the set, something felt different. The legendary actor moved with his characteristic slow, deliberate pace, his steely blue eyes scanning the studio. He settled into the guest chair across from Stephanopoulos, adjusting his jacket with the same methodical precision that defined his screen presence. "Good morning, Clint," Stephanopoulos began, flashing his practiced television smile. "Thanks for joining us today." "Morning," Eastwood replied in his familiar, gravelly voice, his expression neutral but alert. The first few minutes went by as expected. Stephanopoulos asked about the new film, and Eastwood responded with his trademark composure. He spoke passionately about the project, describing its story and the talented cast he'd worked with. His answers were thoughtful, measured, and exactly what the morning show audience had tuned in for. But then, the tone shifted. "Clint, you've been in this business for a very long time," Stephanopoulos said, leaning in slightly. "You've seen Hollywood changed dramatically over the decades. Some would say the industry has become more socially conscious, more aware of representation and diversity. How do you feel about those changes?" Eastwood's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. This wasn't the question he'd been expecting, and it certainly wasn't part of the agreed upon talking points. "Well, George," Eastwood said slowly, "I think good stories are good stories, regardless of who tells them or who stars in them. I've always believed in hiring the best person for the job. But surely you recognize that the industry needed to change," Stephanopoulos pressed, "that there were systemic issues that had to be addressed." Addressing. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop a few degrees. Eastwood's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle signal, but one that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning. "I think," Eastwood began, his voice taking on that familiar edge that had made him famous in westerns, "that good filmmaking has always been about telling honest stories with authentic characters. Politics and agendas tend to get in the way of that." Stephanopoulos leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. But isn't it political to ignore these issues?" he asked. "To pretend that representation doesn't matter?" "I'm not pretending anything," Eastwood replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I'm saying that when you start making movies to check boxes instead of telling stories, you end up with propaganda, not entertainment." The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was clearly not the lighthearted morning television they had expected. Behind the cameras, operators exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. "That's an interesting perspective," Stephanopoulos said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. "Some might say that's the privilege of someone who's never had to worry about representation." Eastwood's eyes flashed. "Privilege, son?" he said, the word sharp. "I grew up during the Depression. I dug swimming pools. I worked in a steel mill before I ever set foot on a movie set. I earned everything I got through hard work, not because of anyone's idea of what I deserved based on who I was." "But you have to admit the industry was different then," Stephanopoulos pressed, seemingly oblivious to the warning signs. "Opportunities weren't equally available to everyone." "The industry was tough on everyone," Eastwood shot back. "I spent years getting rejected, playing bit parts, working for practically nothing. Nobody handed me anything because I was white or male or anything else. I succeeded because I kept working when other people gave up." The tension in the studio was now palpable. Back in the control room, producers were frantically trying to decide whether to intervene or let the confrontation unfold. This was either going to be a public relations disaster or the most talked about morning show segment in years. "I think you're missing the point," Stephanopoulos said, his professional composure beginning to fray. "The system itself was biased." The system was tough, Eastwood corrected firmly. There's a difference between something being difficult and something being unfair. Life isn't supposed to be easy. Movies aren't supposed to be therapy sessions where everyone gets a participation trophy. Stephanopoulos' face was beginning to flush. So you don't think there were barriers that prevented talented people from getting opportunities? I think there are always barriers, Eastwood replied evenly. The question is whether you spend your time complaining about them or finding ways to overcome them. The interview was rapidly spiraling away from the producer's control, from anything resembling morning television pleasantries. What had started as a simple promotional appearance was now something else entirely. Raw, intense, and deeply personal, and Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. If anything, Eastwood's calm and measured responses seemed to embolden the host, as if he sensed some crack in the legendary actor's armor, a refusal to fully engage with his increasingly pointed questions. But Clint, Stephanopoulos said, pressing harder now, surely you can acknowledge that your generation of filmmakers had advantages that others didn't. The old boy network, the exclusionary practices. Eastwood's expression hardened. My generation, he repeated, his voice low. You mean the generation that fought in World War II? The generation that built this country into what it became? That generation. That's not what I mean, Stephanopoulos fired back, abandoning any pretense of journalistic neutrality. I mean the generation that controlled Hollywood for decades, while keeping others out. The studio fell completely silent. Even the crew stopped what they were doing, riveted by the confrontation now unfolding on live television. Eastwood leaned back in his chair slowly, his gaze fixed on Stephanopoulos with the same quiet intensity he once brought to squinting across a dusty frontier town at an outlaw. George, he said quietly, dangerously, I think you've got me confused with someone else. I've never kept anyone out of anything. I've hired actors and crew members based on one thing, their ability to do the job. Period. That's easy to say now, Stephanopoulos replied, his confidence growing. But the record speaks for itself. How many of your films featured diverse casts? How many women directors did you champion? Eastwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair. The record? He said, his voice rising just slightly. Let me tell you about the record, son. I made movies about subjects that mattered. I told stories about real people facing real challenges. I didn't make casting decisions based on some checklist dreamed up by people who've never spent a single day on a movie set. So you admit that diversity wasn't a priority for you, Stephanopoulos said, leaning in as if scoring a point. I admit, Eastwood replied sharply, that good storytelling was my priority, always has been, always will be. He paused for just a breath, then continued, his voice now fully carrying the weight of his presence. You want to talk about diversity? I made movies about soldiers, cops, cowboys, boxers, ordinary people trying to make their way in the world. I showed America to itself, warts and all. But you showed it, Stephanopoulos said, from a very specific perspective, the perspective of white, male, conservative America. That did it. Eastwood's legendary composure finally cracked. Conservative America? He said, his voice now steely and unrestrained. You think Unforgiven was conservative? You think $1 Million Baby was some right-wing fantasy? Eastwood shot back, incredulous. You obviously haven't been paying attention to the movies I've been making. Those are exceptions, Stephanopoulos dismissed. Your overall body of work promotes a very specific worldview. My worldview. Eastwood leaned forward, his eyes blazing. My worldview is that people should take responsibility for their actions, work hard for what they want, and treat others with respect. If that's controversial to you, then maybe you're the one with the problem. The producers in the control room were now in full-blown panic. What was supposed to be a feel-good segment celebrating a Hollywood legend had turned into a political powder keg, but Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. But don't you think your films perpetuate certain stereotypes about masculinity, about violence as a solution to problems? He continued relentlessly. Eastwood stood up. The sudden scrape of his chair against the studio floor echoed like a gunshot through the silent set. Stereotypes? He said, towering over the seated host. You want to talk about stereotypes? How about the stereotype that everyone who doesn't agree with your political views is automatically a racist or a sexist or whatever other label you want to slap on them? Stephanopoulos looked momentarily stunned by Eastwood's imposing presence, but he kept going. I'm just asking legitimate questions about your work and its impact. No, you're not, Eastwood snapped. His voice now carried the full weight of a man who had weathered decades in the harshest arenas of Hollywood. You're trying to ambush me on live television television because you think it'll make good TV. You invited me here under false pretenses to talk about my new movie, and instead you're trying to prosecute me for the crime of making movies that people actually want to see. I think you're being overly sensitive, Stephanopoulos muttered, clearly trying to regain control. Sensitive? Eastwood let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. George, I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I've been criticized by professionals, by experts, by people who actually understand what it takes to make a movie, but I've never had someone sit across from me and accuse me of being a bad person because my movies don't match their political agenda. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's not what I'm doing. That's exactly what you're doing, Eastwood fired back. And you're doing it badly. You want to have a political discussion? Fine. But don't hide behind journalism and pretend this is about my career. You've got an axe to grind, and you thought you could use me to sharpen it. Stephanopoulos' face was now noticeably red. I'm trying to have a thoughtful conversation about important issues. No, Eastwood said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You're trying to create a moment. You're trying to get me to say something you can clip and throw on social media to fit whatever narrative you're pushing this week. He took a step closer, locking eyes with the host. But I'm not playing that game. The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Audience members shifted nervously in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. A few looked toward the exits. Others simply stared, frozen in disbelief. This wasn't the morning show segment they'd expected. Behind the cameras, the operators kept filming, though several had their fingers hovering over buttons, ready to cut the feed at a moment's notice. I think you're misunderstanding my intentions, Stephanopoulos said, his voice suddenly lacking the earlier confidence. Your intentions, Eastwood replied coldly, are crystal clear. You booked me on this show hoping to make me the villain in your little morality play. Well, congratulations, George. You got your confrontation. I hope it was worth it. Stephanopoulos was clearly rattled, but pride wouldn't let him step back. If anything, Eastwood's direct challenge seemed to ignite something defensive and ugly. You know what, Clint? Stephanopoulos snapped, his professional mask slipping entirely. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being questioned about your legacy. Maybe you're just not used to someone actually challenging your outdated views. The words hung in the air like a gun drawn at high noon. A challenge. Thrown down in broad daylight. Eastwood stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deadly calm. Outdated views? He repeated slowly. Son, let me tell you something about outdated views. He took a step forward. I believe in treating people with dignity, no matter who they are. I believe you earn respect through your actions, not by demanding it because of your identity. I believe in telling stories that matter, to real people living real lives. He paused. If those are outdated views, then I'm proud to be outdated. But Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. Oblivious to how far out of his depth he was, he continued. But you have to admit, he said, voice tight, that the world has moved beyond the simplistic morality of your films. Today's audiences want more complexity, more nuance. Eastwood let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Complexity? He repeated. You want to lecture me? About complexity. I made a movie about a racist old man who learns to see past his prejudices. I made a movie about a female boxer fighting a world that didn't believe in her. I made movies about the cost of violence, the burden of leadership, the price of redemption. He leaned in, his voice hardening. But apparently none of that matters to you, because I didn't check the right political boxes. Those themes were always secondary to the main narrative, Stephanopoulos insisted. Your films primarily celebrate a certain type of masculine heroism that many people find problematic today. Problematic. Eastwood tilted his head and gave a half smile. Not amused, disgusted. There's that word again. Problematic. Everything's problematic to you people, isn't it? Standing up for what's right is problematic. Taking responsibility for your actions is problematic. Protecting the people you care about is Problematic. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The studio was now utterly silent, except for the low, persistent hum of the cameras and the oppressive heat of the lights. Even the producers in the control room had stopped trying to intervene, as if realizing this confrontation had slipped out of their hands entirely. It had taken on a life of its own. I'm not saying those things are inherently wrong, Stephanopoulos said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm saying your films present them in a way that excludes other perspectives, other voices. Other voices? Eastwood's voice rose sharply. George, I've been making movies for over 50 years. I've worked with actors from every background imaginable. I've told stories about every kind of person you can think of. But apparently that doesn't count because I didn't make enough speeches about it. Because I didn't pat myself on the back for my enlightened casting choices. Stephanopoulos didn't relent. But surely, he pressed, you can see how your influence shaped Hollywood in ways that weren't always positive. That was the final straw. Eastwood's composure, renowned for its granite-like steadiness, shattered. My influence, he roared, his voice echoing through the set with startling force. You want to know about my influence? I helped create an entire genre of filmmaking. I showed that movies could be both popular and meaningful. I proved that audiences were hungry for stories about real human beings facing real moral choices. And yes, I made money doing it, because that's how the movie business works. Stephanopoulos tried to interject, but Eastwood wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But more than that, he continued, his voice filled with fury and conviction. I've employed thousands of people over the decades, actors, writers, directors, crew members, craftsmen, artists. I gave opportunities to people who deserved them, based on talent, not checklists. I created jobs, I created careers, I created a body of work that people still watch, still talk about, decades later. I understand that, Stephanopoulos started weakly. No, you don't. Eastwood cut him off like a blade. You don't understand anything about what it takes to make a movie, what it costs, what's at stake every single time you roll the cameras. You sit behind a desk and pontificate about representation and diversity and social justice, but you've never put your own money on the line to tell a story. You've never had to convince a room full of investors to take a chance on your vision. You've never had to look a crew member in the eye and tell them the movie's been canceled and now they're out of work. Stephanopoulos was visibly squirming, but his ego refused to retreat. That's exactly the kind of attitude that kept Hollywood from progressing, he said desperately. This obsession with profit over principles. Eastwood stared at him, eyes wide, blinking slowly, disbelief etched into every line of his weathered face. Profit over principles? He repeated, his voice hushed now, but seething. George, let me tell you something about principles. Profit over principles? Eastwood echoed, shaking his head. George, without profit, there are no movies. Without commercial success, there are no jobs, no stories, no anything. You can have all the principles in the world, but if nobody wants to watch what you're making, you're not changing anything. You're just talking to yourself. But surely art should be about more than just commercial appeal, Stephanopoulos argued. Art? Eastwood's voice dripped with contempt. You want to lecture me about art? I've been making art longer than you've been breathing. Real art. Art that speaks to people. Art that matters. Not the kind of pretentious, self-congratulatory garbage that wins awards and puts audiences to sleep. The confrontation had now reached a fever pitch. Eastwood stood tall, looming over Stephanopoulos. His legendary presence filled the studio like thunderclouds before a storm. The host looked small by comparison, petty even, his perfectly curated media persona crumbling under the weight of Eastwood's righteous fury. Look, Stephanopoulos stammered, making one last desperate attempt to steer the moment back. I think we're getting off track here. All I'm trying to do is have an honest conversation about your career and its impact on popular culture. Honest? Eastwood barked a harsh laugh. There's nothing honest about this ambush. You brought me here under false pretenses, hoping to score political points. And when I didn't play along, you decided to attack me personally. That's not journalism, George. That's activism masquerading as journalism. I resent that characterization, Stephanopoulos said sharply, his voice rising in protest. Resent it all you want. Eastwood's voice was cold and final. It's the truth. You came into this interview with your mind made up. About me, about my films, about everything I represent. This whole thing was just an attempt to get me to confirm your biases. The studio was electric with tension. Crew members were frozen in place. No one dared speak. The audience barely breathed. Everyone could sense it. This was the climax. "I think you're being unfair," Stephanopoulos muttered, but the conviction had bled from his voice. Eastwood looked down at him, his steel gaze softening just slightly, tinged now with something like pity. "Unfair?" he repeated. "You know what's unfair, George. What's unfair is inviting someone on your show to promote their work, and then spending the entire time trying to tear down their life's accomplishments. What's unfair is using your platform to push a political agenda, instead of doing your job as a journalist." He paused, just long enough for the silence to land like a sledgehammer. "But you know what?" he said finally. "I'm done with this charade. I came here to talk about movies, about storytelling, about the craft I've spent my entire life devoted to. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who thinks he knows better than 50 years of experience in this business." Eastwood gave Stephanopoulos one last look, piercing, unwavering. Then he turned, adjusted his jacket, and walked off the set. No music, no applause, just stunned silence. And somewhere, off camera, a producer whispered the words, "We're gonna be trending for a week." Eastwood reached down and began unhooking his microphone with slow, practiced precision. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. "Wait," Stephanopoulos blurted, the panic suddenly audible in his voice. It was only now hitting him. His big moment was slipping away. "We're not finished here." Eastwood looked up from the mic, his expression cold and final. "Oh, we're finished? All right." He stood tall, eyes locked on the host. "I don't have to sit here and listen to you disrespect me, my work, or the people I've worked with over the years. I've made my last movie, George, but I haven't forgotten how to walk off a set when someone's wasting my time." "You can't just leave," Stephanopoulos protested weakly. "This is live television." Eastwood didn't flinch. "Watch me." With that, he dropped the microphone onto the chair. Thud. The sound echoed through the stunned studio like a closing door. Then he turned, facing the cameras directly. The room stilled. Even the lights seemed to hold their breath. And in that moment, Clint Eastwood became every legendary character he'd ever played. The lone man standing for what he believed in. "Folks," he said, addressing the audience at home with the gravitas of a statesman and the grit of a gunslinger, "I apologize that you had to witness this. I came here to talk about making movies, about telling stories that matter. Instead, I got lectured by someone who apparently thinks that decades of hard work and success count for nothing if you don't subscribe to the right political beliefs." Stephanopoulos tried to interject, but Eastwood silenced him with a look, the kind of look that could stop a charging bull mid-stride. "I've spent my entire career trying to entertain people, to tell stories that resonate, to create something lasting and meaningful. If that's not good enough for some people, well, that's their problem, not mine." And with that, the 94-year-old icon turned and walked off the set. His stride was steady, purposeful, dignified. No words, no music, just the sound of his footsteps echoing across the studio floor, growing fainter, and then gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanopoulos sat frozen at the interview desk, face flushed, composure shattered. He looked around, silently begging for someone to step in, but no one did. Not the producers, not the camera crew, not the audience. They were all staring at him, with expressions that ranged from shock to disappointment. The cameras kept rolling. Every second of the host's humiliation caught on film. Every attempt to find words to salvage what had just happened. Pointless. Because in trying to diminish a Hollywood legend, George Stephanopoulos had only succeeded in diminishing himself. The greatest showdown in morning television history was over, and there was no question who had emerged victorious. So, what do you think about Clint Eastwood's legendary exit from that disastrous Good Morning America interview? Did George Stephanopoulos get what he deserved for trying to ambush the Hollywood icon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this story isn't just news, it's history.